NCPRO. Our office was created a couple of years ago by the General Assembly, and our role is to provide oversight, coordination, and technical assistance, and to ensure proper reporting and accounting for all of the COVID funds that come through the state. So we, as a state, have gotten quite a lot of COVID money. Some of that goes directly to individuals, directly to schools, directly to hospitals, but about $11 billion of it is coming through our office, and that is equivalent to about 9 different funds. And I would just ask if you have not muted yourself, if you could, please, that would be great. Okay, thanks. And we are considered as the state the prime recipient for these funds, and our job is to manage the funds as required by the various federal entities that we deal with, in this case the U.S. Treasury, and to provide assistance for those of you who are getting the funds, and to make sure that we report on them as is required by the federal government, and that we are following applicable state and federal rules. And we will talk a little bit more about that as we go along today. Next slide, please. So the first thing we want to talk to you about is the U.S. Treasury and the guidance that they provide. So your entity is receiving a portion of the state of North Carolina State Fiscal Recovery Funds. We got $5.4 billion as a state, and the legislature allocated or appropriated all of those funds last November, and then has issued a couple of technical correction bills. But there are 24 state entities that are responsible for these funds in terms of running different programs or working directly with different beneficiaries. You guys are all getting your funds through our office, and there are about 189 different recipient initial subrecipients in terms of project agreements. So these federal funds, we do have to follow the federal rules because the money comes directly to us from Congress, and they are defined in the Congressional Federal Register, Section 2, Part 200. And these requirements include rules for grants administration, procurement, cost principles, audits, all the fun, exciting information. So as we work directly with the U.S. Treasury, since they are the federal agency responsible for these funds, we make sure that we work with them on compliance and eligible uses and any other things that we have to follow. And there is a web address on the slide, and that is where you can get more information. So the way this typically works is that the U.S. Treasury, or whatever federal entity, in this case it is U.S. Treasury, will provide an interim rule, and then states and others have an opportunity to give responses and feedback on that, which we did along with our other states and local governments. And so that interim rule was published, I think, last August, and then Treasury took all that information in and published their final rule with the way these funds will be governed in January of this year. However, from time to time, they do also publish frequently asked questions. So NCPRO and other states and other entities will ask Treasury questions as things arise in our use of the funds, and they will publish those answers. We never really know when they're going to publish the answers to these frequently asked questions, but it can actually change the requirements for the use and administration of funds. So most recently on April 27th, we got some additional FAQs that came out, and that made us have to pivot a little bit in terms of what they were going to look for in terms of compliance and what rules we were going to have to follow. So our office does monitor those FAQs, and we do communicate with U.S. Treasury on a regular basis. Again, we don't always get answers. We don't always know when we're going to get answers, but we are working with them on a regular basis. So as we work through your fund usage and we all have questions, then we will work to figure out the answers. And just know that sometimes it takes a little bit of time when you're working with the federal government. So NCPRO's here. If you have questions, ask us. That's what we're here for. That's our job. Next slide, please. Generally, these are the 4 big buckets of funds: COVID response and adaptation, premium pay, revenue loss, and infrastructure investments. And our legislature has made these appropriations in the 4 of the buckets. Next slide, please. So we want to talk with you next about the steps in the process. And as you can see this, it's a little bit simplified, but there's essentially 9 steps. I think most, if not all of you, have already gotten your project templates. Let's see, does somebody have a question? Okay, so you can see most of you have gotten a project template, and we've used that information to kind of help you plan for the use of funds and make sure if the legislature is asking you to run a program that you sort of know or have thought through some of the things that and challenges that you'll face as we make sure we comply with the federal and the state rules. And then depending on your fiscal needs and how that's going to work, the legislature actually instructed us in the budget to disperse funds on a quarterly basis unless otherwise required. So we are basically working with each entity to determine what your needs are based on the program that you are running. So we then take all that information. We are sending you an MOU. If you've not already done it, signing your MOU electronically, you send it back to NCPRO, and we are also using a system for grants management called PANGRAM to allow us to track each of these projects, and you can use it to request your funding as needed as you move through the through your project that you're working on. And so we also have information in here, and we'll talk more about it. If your entity has subrecipients, what the requirements are, how that will work. We plan to have a future meeting where we really go through the subrecipients requirements in depth. We did not want to get into that too much because we know not all of you will have subrecipients, and there are quite a lot of rules for subrecipients, and if you don't have subrecipients, it's really probably not something that you need to sit through, as it could cause confusion. And then we will talk a little bit about the reporting requirements that we'll have you do. And then just a reminder to everybody, the Treasury, U.S. Treasury requires that all of the funds under the state fiscal recovery funds are obligated by December 31st, 2024, and they have to be spent by December 31st, 2026. So, if you run into any problems or any challenges, we'll need to work through those so we can make sure that you are able to use all of your funds. Next slide, please. So this is something that hopefully is familiar to everyone, and these were our project templates. This is just a quick picture of it on the right-hand side. We shared these and have had meetings with most of you earlier to help you kind of define your programs and to get the information that we need to help get your MOU started and put all that information together. And I actually was a little bit late to our call because I was talking with the state auditor's office, and this is something I'm sure that the auditors will want to see to make sure that we're following all the processes and procedures. So this is something that will be helpful to you, hopefully, and helpful to us throughout the life of your project. Next slide, please. So the MOU, I think many of you have received these, but if not, this is what this is going to look like. This is not the actual document, but this will tell you a little bit about the process. As you know, these funds are given to us by Congress. Again, they're appropriated by the North Carolina General Assembly. So they tell us what they want us to do with the money. And our office helps with monitoring, oversight, reporting, and disbursement of funds. So the MOUs really provide the information that you need to manage cash flow, to let us know what you need in terms of the Federal Grants Administration and the requirements. And it sounds like we have a question. Do you want to go ahead and ask your question? Tony, Floyd, did you have a question?
No,
I'm
I
sorry.
just logged on late. I apologize.
Oh, it's okay. I just wanted to make sure because we couldn't tell. No problem. And so these MOUs, we did put a lot of language in them. Don't be intimidated by the size, but we felt like it was more helpful for you to have the federal rules in front of you than it was to have to go and click multiple different links. I don't know about you, but whenever I get those things like when I have to check my Apple iPhone, did I read all this? I don't always read all of it. This should be a helpful document that you can go back to and make sure you understand the financial and reporting elements, the formats, the rules under 2 CFR 200 that are applicable, as well as we have state rules that we follow as well, and those are under Section 9 of the North Carolina Administrative Code, Part 3M. So next slide, please. So if you're somewhere along the process, here's what we need you to do. If you have not returned your project template to NCPRO, please do that. If you need help completing it, we'll be more than happy to meet with you and work through any questions you may have. We oftentimes, and we've had a few struggles with working through the various state entities to make sure that your financial information is right and you're receiving your funds in a timely manner. So if we're reaching out to you to ask you for more information, it could be that there's something in North Carolina's very old accounting systems that did not work the way it should have. And part of that is just that we have very old systems and we're making sure that everything is right. And so we may ask you for that information. We try not to ask you more than once, but again, sometimes as we work with the Office of State Budget Management, as we work with the State Controller's Office, we do have some glitches, and so we are working through some of those. I think we've had some this week. And we'll also ask you to review, sign, and respond to your MOU. We are using DocuSign for that process, and that seems to have worked very well for most people. Again, if you have any challenges with that, to let us know. The grants management tool we use is PANGRAM. So we have a quick account meeting set up and kind of walk you through it on how to use it and what it looks like. And that's also a really helpful meeting to attend. And then make sure you're returning your attachments A and B. And again, most of this information you've probably already put together in the project template, so you can cut and paste. And we'll add more information in a different session for any entities that have additional subrecipients. Next slide, please. So this is what entities who are beneficiaries need to do. We get you to certify that you've experienced a negative public health impact or negative economic impact as a result of the pandemic, and that prior federal and state assistance does not duplicate the benefits of this award. This is just to make sure, again, that we follow the U.S. Treasury Guidance, that everything is all in line as we need it to be. And again, probably something that we'll have the state auditors look at. Next slide, please. So this is the homepage for our grants information management system, or PANGRAM. And Youngjin Lee, who runs that for us, is here if you have any specific questions about PANGRAM. But this gives you a screenshot of what it looks like. And there is a link at the bottom to our user guide, which is really helpful and very simplified. Next slide, please. So then moving on, the next thing we really want to talk with you about is defining these key sort of administrative key terms under the federal and state administrative codes. A subrecipient is an entity that receives financial assistance to carry out a project. So again, these are identified by the legislature in the budget. It says whether or not they're asking you to do something specifically with these funds, or perhaps you are a beneficiary, which is an individual or entity receiving funds for the purpose of offsetting a bad public experience from a public health impact or a negative economic impact to the pandemic. So depending on which one of those categories you fall into, it will dictate what requirements we need out of you. If it's more of we do some monitoring and things like that, or if as a beneficiary we ask you to sort of tell us and what your economic impacts were, and we kind of move on from there. You may also encounter contractors, so those entities that are under contract to provide a service for a recipient or a subrecipient. So these distinctions do matter. Subrecipients are subject to subrecipient monitoring and reporting requirements. Those are quite extensive. The beneficiaries are not. You kind of give us your that tells us, what your impacts have been, and you certify that, and you don't have any double dipping, and you're other than reporting, it's a much easier road in terms of how often we work with you. And then again, contractors are hired by recipients and subrecipients. They are subject to federal, state, and procurement rules. Again, this can be a little bit tricky for some folks, so we'll work with you to help you figure out which category you fall into. And again, we use what the legislature asks us to do with the funds in the budget as the basis for these decisions. Next slide, please. So Andy McCracken is in charge of reporting for NCPRO, and he and his team, Mikey Bennett and Natalie Garrett, I think are both here, and they will talk with you about what we need for you for reporting. And again, please feel free to ask questions.
Great, thanks, Stephanie. Good afternoon, everyone. We'll provide a pretty high-level overview of the reporting requirements on state fiscal recovery funds. I'm happy to answer questions as we go. We are trying to first communicate what our responsibilities as the state's coordinating agency of these funds, what our responsibilities to U.S. Treasury and the legislature are as it pertains to reporting, and then what that means for what we need to ask of you all to keep up with everything that we have to communicate to our oversight agencies, entities at the federal and state level. And then I will say we are also preparing a handbook about reporting, which will go into far more detail and really provide step-by-step information on how to do all of this, when to do all of this, what needs to be reported, and all of that. So this will be foundational info, and we'll follow up with more. But again, happy to answer questions the extent to which we have information all prepared for you. So to get started, we have to submit reports primarily to U.S. Treasury and to the General Assembly. With U.S. Treasury, there is a quarterly project and expenditures report that we have to submit at the end of the month following the end of a quarter. And then there's also an annual performance report that we have to submit, which gets more into the performance measurement and tracking issues like equity, use of evidence, some other topics that the federal government's interested in. With the legislative report, we provide that quarterly to the legislature, and that tracks really by agency and by non-state entities the funding that they've used from their appropriations and how they've used it. There are generally three main buckets as we've categorized it for our SFRF reporting. First is the project level reporting. Second is sub-project level, and then finally there's performance metrics. So project level is some baseline information that Treasury needs to know about a project as a whole. We are defining a project as anything that has received a unique contract number. So if we have an MOU with you, that MOU means that we are reporting project level information about that to U.S. Treasury. So there's some baseline info. We'll get into that. If your entity further subgrants funding, either through, like Stephanie mentioned, through a contract or a subaward or anything along those lines. If you are running a beneficiary program, we need to provide Treasury information about those what we're classifying generally as sub-project level activities. We have to provide that, and there is a certain threshold for the level that determines the level of detail we have to provide. And then finally, performance metrics will primarily be driven by the annual performance report that I mentioned for U.S. Treasury. And so the intent is to work with the various SFRF recipients to identify appropriate performance metrics based on intended outcomes and matching up with legislative intent to track the impact of these programs. I will address sort of the implications of this for non-state agency or non-state entities that are themselves considered beneficiaries, and I've already seen some questions in the chat related to that, but so we will address that in a couple of slides here. So for project level reporting, there's financial and expenditure information we are required to submit to Treasury, as well as some programmatic information. The programmatic information includes stuff that is that we have to ask of everybody, as well as things that are specific to various expenditure categories as defined by U.S. Treasury. For all of these projects, someone correct me if I'm wrong, these are all classified under revenue replacement, so we can talk about those specific requirements. What to report, we will provide what the standard set of questions are, and then how to report, as Stephanie outlined, this will all be conducted through the PANGRAM system. The project level information that we are outlining here will be submitted as direct input into your portal. And then there will be attachments that you will upload to provide any supplemental information, including sub-award or sub-project level reporting. These are the data elements, the core data elements that we have to collect, or that we will be collecting for all projects. So we will circulate this slide after, and again, the guidance that we put out will provide some more definitions and clarity on exactly what all this entails. But at a basic level, we need to know how much of the funding has been spent, how much of the funding has been obligated. A quick note on that. Treasury, I know there are some varying definitions of obligation, and particularly related to like encumbrances and such. Treasury wants to know, they're considering obligation in relation to the December 2024 deadline to obligate these funds. So if you have planned uses, if you have entered a contract to commit funds, that sets sort of the ceiling of what has been obligated at that point. And then the expenditures match up to that. In some accounting methods, the obligations would go down when actual expenditures go up. But for these purposes, we just need to know in total how much has actually been committed out the door with these funds, and that'll be a cumulative total as we go. There's some unique questions that are specific to capital expenditures and program income. As I mentioned, there will be some specific. There's a template that we'll need to require for any sub-project level activities. So if you made any new subawards or have subaward expenditures, or if you've made changes to an existing subaward, there'll be a template for how you report that to us, so we can report that to U.S. Treasury. And then there's just some baseline. We really just want to know this at the front end of the project, and then some updates there on out. You know, who is the program intended to serve? You are allowed to select up to 3 different sort of target populations. There's a drop-down menu. Again, we'll provide details on what that includes. And then we need to know what's the structure and the objectives of your program, and then how are you approaching implementation. So these are the core data elements that we're going to be asking of all recipients. And we'll happy to answer questions about that. And I should note that there are some additional questions that for revenue replacement projects, there will be one additional programmatic data element, which is asking you all to define some metric of who you are serving. So for example, you can select number of households your program is impacting, number of small businesses, number of nonprofits, and so on. So you would indicate what the service population is, and then you can indicate over that reporting period what's the number, even if it's an estimate, that's fine, the number of entities that the program has impacted. Great. So sub-project level reporting. This information satisfies, for those of you who are familiar with FFATA, I can never remember what it actually stands for. It's Federal Financial Assistance and Transparency Act. Did I get that right? But it's a mechanism that the federal government put in place about 15 years ago to better track where federal aid is going around the country and how it's being spent. So it requires at a sub-award level to know what funds have been committed beyond that beyond the recipient and how that's been awarded. So we follow the same definitions here that Stephanie provided earlier related to contractors, subgrantees, and beneficiaries. And then we'll need to know at that level how much funding has been committed to those entities, and then what the expenditures related to those activities are. Again, we will provide some follow-up guidance and definitions to make this all clear. There is a reporting threshold for, or a financial threshold for the level of detail required for this reporting. Under normal FFATA requirements, that threshold is $30,000. U.S. Treasury has provided that the threshold will be $50,000 for state fiscal recovery funds. So that's just a note that this still satisfies that requirement. So if you all pass on or further award or contract funds in excess of $50,000, there is additional reporting that's required on those awards. We need to know more information about that subrecipient, as well as what funding has been committed to them as obligations and what funding has been expended to meet those obligations. And then here's this chart. Any awards that do not meet that $50,000 threshold can be reported in aggregate. And in all circumstances, regardless of the financial amount, payments to individuals are reported in aggregate. So that's an important note there. If there's a sole proprietorship, I guess would be an example. If there's a sole proprietorship that has been awarded $100,000, they're still reported as an individual here, and so that would get folded in as a payment to individual. I do want to note there's been concerns about SAM.gov registration. It is something that we have to report to U.S. Treasury. During the current transition from DUNS numbers to UEI, there have been a number of problems. There's a huge backlog of providing UEI. So for the time being, Treasury is allowing entities in lieu of providing a UEI, they're allowing tax ID numbers, so EIN or whatever whatever you have for those entities can be reported in lieu of a UEI for the time being, and we're going to continue pushing on that as long as folks in the state are running into issues actually receiving their UEI. We have a consolidated template for how to report this sub-project level information. And then again, we are coming out with guidance and some resources to help you all navigate this successfully. We know it gets complicated. We're trying to reduce the burden on all of this. We're asking because we are being asked for this information. So we're trying to get through all this together and make this as clear as it can be as we move through these reporting processes. So this flow chart here on the screen is an example of something that we are providing to help identify, with an individual sub-recipient, do you need to report that information to us individually, or is that reported in aggregate? And then related to that, within the reporting template we are providing, where does that information actually get inputted? So stay tuned for the more complete suite of resources that we'll be providing in the reporting handbook. Great. So I just want to make a few notes here about beneficiaries. U.S. Treasury at this point, it still needs to know information about beneficiaries. The real benefit with being a beneficiary is that there isn't a monitoring requirement. However, there's some basic information that we still need to provide as we are tracking and reporting these funds. So for now, all the info that I outlined, the beneficiaries will need to report. The exception to that will be if you are a beneficiary entity, there are no, trying to figure out how to phrase this right. If you're a beneficiary, you are receiving financial assistance as a result of the economic impacts of the pandemic. There's no further subawarding of those funds from a federal reporting standpoint, from a federal reporting lens. So you wouldn't have to report any sub-project level activity to us if you are a beneficiary project. That said, there's still information that we want to know about how you are spending the funds, and that really gets into the performance reporting, where similar to what is on the what's on the project templates, the project planning templates that that many, if not all of you, have seen. That information we will be coming back around again for as we prepare the annual performance report to U.S. Treasury. That's where we want to know, even though it's a beneficiary program, we want to know generally how did you use the funds? What was the impact of those funds? It's important that we understand sort of the complete picture of how this financial assistance benefited your organizations and the populations that you serve in order to more fully understand the impact of these programs and demonstrate that there was good stuff being done with all this, so that we have a little bit of we have more visibility into what needs to happen in the face of similar disruptions or economic challenges down the road. So it is important that we understand this information from you all, including from beneficiaries, but hopefully it's a little bit of a reduced burden from everything that we just outlined. So with that, we'll walk quickly through the deadlines. And again, this will be provided in more specificity in the reporting handbook, but generally reports are due to be submitted in PANGRAM by the 15th day of the month following the applicable reporting period. So if it's a monthly reporting item, which most of the expenditure information is, that would be due in PANGRAM that month immediately following. So if it's in August, expenditure data for the month of August, then by September 15th, that needs to be up in PANGRAM. We are happy if you submit it sooner than that, but that is the deadline. If you run into challenges facing that deadline, please communicate with your grants manager so we know when to include it. We are placing those deadlines in because that is we have tight turnarounds then for compiling and getting this information to the agencies that NCPRO has to report all this to on behalf of you all. Quarterly reports similarly on the 15th day, and then the annual reporting. One note about the annual reporting, as I mentioned, as we went on, there's some information that we'll need to know as projects get started. So that would technically satisfy like the initial annual report. And then from there on out, annual reports will be due over the summer to align with that annual report we have to submit to U.S. Treasury. So with that, we'll pause. Happy to answer questions. I'm happy to answer questions about the reporting. We have the close to full NCPRO team on the call here to help with other questions or concerns that you all have. And thank you all for being on. Happy to answer questions. Great question from Michelle about who needs to do monthly versus quarterly reports. So everybody, there is monthly and so there's monthly information that's required from everybody. For the most part, right, as of today, the reporting information is primarily focused on monthly and annual reports. We have to provide quarterly reports to U.S. Treasury and to the General Assembly, but we are pulling that information from the monthly reporting that you all are providing to us. If there are more specific quarterly reports that will be specified in the guidance, we'll make sure that you know, but everything that I just outlined applies to everybody. There's some programs that are monthly and some other programs that are quarterly. When does the monthly reporting start? Does it start with the first month that funds are drawn and then monthly after that? Yes. So as soon as as we roll out this reporting guidance, anyone that is using these funds or expects to receive the funds, the reporting will start then. Happy to defer to any of my NCPRO colleagues on any other notes on that question. Do you require monthly reports even if there are no expenditures? Thinking about programmatic progress. So that's a really good question, Sarah. I think we'll have to get back to you on that, on making sure that that's a good question on if there's nothing to report, do you have to submit something? So we'll we
yeah,
will.
because like for instance, some of us there we have two entities. One is a contractor, one is a subrecipient. Both of them are going to get like quarterly allocations, and then they're going to be reporting to us with some frequency. But I don't want to present to you monthly expenditures because that's not what's in our ledger. Our ledger is going to be the quarterly disbursement.
Got it. Let's follow up with you. I definitely understand the issue. So we'll follow up with you all on that and be sure to address that in the guidance.
Also, just know financial aid. They want it's going to follow the academic year. Anything financial aid related.
Yeah, for reporting, we require our recipients to submit a monthly report, even there's no monthly expenditures. So we know, like, you didn't forget to report to us for the previous months. Sarah, for your questions, we can discuss in details how to report this to be complete and accurate. But yeah, even there's no expenditure, we still expect our recipient to submit $0 expenditure for previous months.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Imogen. Can we review the differences between beneficiary, grant recipient, and subrecipient?
Yes, if you go back a few slides. Again, subrecipients are, which is the same thing as a grant recipient for these purposes. A subrecipient, these entities on this call will either be a subrecipient of NCPRO or a beneficiary of NCPRO. You, as a subrecipient, may also have subrecipients as well. And that's what we're going to cover in another call, what that means, because again, if you're a beneficiary, it can get confusing. But a subrecipient is an entity that receives financial assistance from the state of North Carolina to carry out a specific project. A beneficiary is an individual or an entity that receives funds for the purpose of directly benefiting that beneficiary as a result, because the beneficiary experienced a public health impact or a negative impact from the pandemic. And that is defined by the legislature in the budget when they note the purpose for why they appropriated these funds. I hope that is helpful, but please feel free, if not, to ask again, or we can try to explain it a different way. It looks like we have a question about PANGRAM training. That is something that your grants manager will schedule directly with you. So if you have a question about that, I would encourage you to reach out to your grants manager. Any other questions?
I have a question about program the demographics data that you're going to want to collect.
Mhm.
If we are a subrecipient, so we have an MOU and then we have beneficiaries, are we going to be asking our beneficiaries to provide us with demographic data of who they serve? Or are we providing demographic data on who we as subrecipients serve?
The latter. So at you as the recipient of the funding, before you provide aid further down. Now, if I think it may like whoever your beneficiaries are would probably determine who you would indicate as the impacted population or the population served. But that's reported at a project level. We don't need that at a sub-project level.
Okay, so who we're serving are nonprofit organizations. So we just report on the nonprofits that we're serving.
That's right.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and if there's, again, if there's other information that you think is important for folks to know, then I think that's where the annual performance report comes in. And if you have data on, what those nonprofits did with the funding, or further impact from there, you can certainly get that information to us, and we want to know about that. But in terms of that monthly or that sort of foundational requirement of programmatic data at a project level, it's just from your perspective as your organization.
Thank you.
All right, we have a question about beneficiaries and uniform guidance, which I'm happy to hand over to someone else. So Stephanie or Tara. So the question is, want to cycle back to comment from Tara earlier in the chat. If a local government is determined a beneficiary, it is not required to follow uniform guidance, and hiring contractors does not change that. Is that accurate?
It is accurate that a beneficiary is not required to follow uniform guidance, and hiring contractors does not change that. If it is a local government that is a beneficiary, we cannot exempt you from following your own local requirements. So we should have a side conversation about that. From the state perspective, you are considered to be a beneficiary. Mary Beth, are you with Apex or Huntersville?
I'm with Apex.
Yeah, okay. So from the state perspective, you would be considered to be a beneficiary because the legislature is not asking you to do anything with the money. They're just giving it to Apex and Huntersville because of the offset issue. And so you wouldn't have to follow uniform guidance from our perspective, and we're not going to ask you about it. Now, that does not, y'all are kind of an unusual situation in that if you have a town policy or a city policy about having to follow how you do contractors, I would advise you to talk to your attorney and make sure you still follow those processes. But we're not going to come ask you about it from the Treasury perspective of the state fiscal recovery funds. And I think this question has come up as well about your revenue replacement and the 10 million. I would encourage you to use the money you're getting directly from the federal government and count that to your revenue replacement and count all of your state funds as beneficiary money. I think if you try to lump them together under your revenue replacement, you're going to have to follow uniform guidance for that portion of the state fiscal recovery funds that you put under revenue replacement. So we can talk offline more about that if Apex and Huntersville have questions.
Thank you.
So Stephanie, we're not hearing any more questions, I think. So I want to wrap up.
Yeah, just giving people a minute, but I agree. So please, if we didn't answer your question, I think we did answer the ones in the chat, but if you're still confused or you have any other questions that come up, please reach out to your grants manager. You can also reach out to NCPRO. You can stay on at the end of this call and we'll be happy to try to answer questions too for the next 9 minutes. So just let us know. We're really thankful that you joined us and please let us know.
Can I ask very quickly, can you tell us where these slides in this presentation will be made available so that we can view it on demand?
That is Jamila, can you help with that one?
Sure, we're going to send an email out after this meeting, and then we can also place the slides on our website.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you.
Okay, well, thanks everybody. We appreciate you joining and stay tuned to our next session on subrecipients.